You set me up. I protected myself. There's a difference. Ethan, Tori, tell them. Tell them this was agreed to. Tell them we were trying to help.
I made that up. Mom asked me to. She needed to know what you do. Now we know.
My name is Dorothy Calloway. Most people call me Dot. I'm 64 years old. I live alone on a 340-acre ranch in Gillespie County, Texas, and I spent 28 years of my life investigating fraud. I know exactly what it looks like when someone has been planning something for a long time and thinks they've finally gotten away with it. The front door of my home opened at 5:47 in the morning, and the woman who walked through it was not me. She moved through the living room like she already owned it, slow, certain. She ran her fingers along the edge of the fireplace mantel, picked up the framed photo of my husband and me taken on our 32nd wedding anniversary, looked at for exactly 2 seconds, and placed it face down on the wood. Then she said quietly, to no one she thought was listening, "Finally, this is mine now." And I stepped out of the hallway in Raymond's old flannel shirt, coffee in hand, and looked her dead in the eyes. "Sabrina, you're standing in my house." That morning, I needed her to believe she had won. She had no idea I had been 3 steps ahead of her for months. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please stay with me until the end. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Not that morning, not the phone call from Walt at 5:47, not the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway before the sun came up. Before any of that, there was just the land. And before I can make you understand what happened, you need to understand what that land means, not what it's worth on a tax record, what it actually means. 340 acres in the Texas Hill Country. If you've never been out that way, picture this: pink granite pushing up through the soil like the earth is showing you its bones, live oak trees that look like they've been arguing with the wind for 100 years and winning, and a little creek running along the southwest corner that Raymond used to say was the best thing about the whole property. Not the views, not the cattle, not the house we built with our own hands over the course of 2 summers, and a lot of arguments about where to put the kitchen window. The creek. He loved that creek more than anything. My grandfather bought this land in 1961 for $12,000. That sounds almost funny now, given what it's worth today, but back then it wasn't a steal. It was a stretch. He worked 2 jobs for 4 years to put together that money, and when he finally signed the papers, he drove out here alone on a Tuesday morning, stood in the middle of what is now my east pasture, and didn't say a single word. My father told me that story maybe 100 times growing up. He said his father just stood there in the tall grass with his hat in his hands and cried like a baby for about 10 minutes, then got back in his truck and drove home in time for dinner. Didn't tell anyone what he'd done until the next morning at breakfast. That's the kind of thing that doesn't fit on a deed. But it lives in the land anyway. It soaks into the soil and the rock and the roots of those old oaks, and it stays there. I feel it every morning when I walk out onto the back porch and look out at the pasture in the early light, and I felt it even on the worst mornings, even after Raymond was gone, even when I was so tired and so alone that the silence felt like something pressing down on my chest. My father kept this place through the drought of 1980, when half the ranchers in Gillespie County either sold out or walked away from land that had been in their families for generations. He didn't. He got a second job driving a feed truck, and he cut back on everything that could be cut back on, and he held on and he passed it to Raymond and me with the same quiet expectation that had been passed to him. You hold on. That's the job. You hold on. Raymond and I held on through 2008 when the bank called twice in 1 month, and we had $40 in our checking account and a herd that needed feed we weren't sure we could pay for. We didn't sell. We didn't subdivide. We took out a loan we spent the next 6 years paying back, and we held on because by then we understood that this land was bigger than our financial situation. It was bigger than us. It belonged to something longer than either of our lifetimes, and our job was just to be the ones holding it for a while. Raymond passed in 2018, pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't give you much runway to argue with it. From the day we found out to the day I drove home, from that hospital alone, it was 4 months. He was 61 years old. We had 32 years together, and I will tell you honestly, without any sentimentality about it, that I don't think a single one of those years was wasted. We fought sometimes, Lord knows we did, but we always came back to this porch and this view and this land, and we remembered what mattered. After he died, people asked me if I was going to sell. Move closer to Austin, maybe, somewhere smaller and easier to manage. A condo, one woman at church actually suggested. A condo. I looked at her the way you look at someone who has just said something so far outside the bounds of reasonable conversation that you genuinely aren't sure how to respond. I said, I appreciate the thought, and I went home and I fed the cattle and I fixed a stretch of fence on the north property line that Raymond had been meaning to get to, and I did not think about condos again. By 2024, the ranch was appraised at $4.2 million. I know that number because my lawyer mentioned it when we were working through the trust documents. I don't walk around thinking about it that way. But I understand now, in a way I didn't fully understand before all of this happened, exactly why someone else would. I need you to understand one more thing about me before I tell you about Sabrina. And that's what I actually did for 28 years before I retired. People hear insurance fraud investigator, and they picture something either very boring or very dramatic, neither of which is quite right. The reality is somewhere in between, and mostly involves a lot of paperwork, a lot of phone calls, a lot of reading documents in my truck in parking lots, with a gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. I worked cases involving staged accidents, falsified medical claims, forged contractor invoices, manufactured disasters. I worked with county prosecutors and I testified in court, and I sat across tables from people who had built elaborate lies and watched them realize, one piece of evidence at a time, that the thing they thought was airtight had more holes than they knew. Over 28 years and more than 400 cases, I learned one thing above everything else. The most dangerous people are not the ones who seem shady. They're not nervous or evasive or obviously off. The most dangerous people are the ones who are patient, the ones who take their time, the ones who always have a reason that sounds perfectly logical, who make you feel like you're the one being unreasonable if you push back. Those are the ones who are genuinely hard to catch because every individual thing they do looks fine. It's only when you lay it all out on a table and look at the pattern that you see what's been happening. I knew all of that. I had known it professionally for nearly 3 decades, and I still almost missed it. My son Ethan is 34 years old. He works in software engineering down in Austin, solves problems I couldn't begin to describe, and he has called me every single Sunday for the past 6 years without missing one. Not even the Sunday he was camping in Big Bend with no cell service and had to hike 40 minutes to the top of a ridge just to get 2 bars. He called. That's who he is. He got his gentleness from Raymond. I saw his stubbornness early. As a boy of about 8, he decided he was going to build a birdhouse entirely on his own with no help and no instructions, and he spent 3 weekends on it, and it was genuinely the most structurally unsound object I have ever seen, but he was not going to quit, and he was not going to ask for help. And he hung it in the oak tree by the garden, and it lasted 6 years before the wind finally took it down. That stubbornness came from me, and his tendency to see the absolute best in people, to give the benefit of the doubt long past the point where most people would have stopped. That one belongs to both of us, I think, and neither of us. Raymond used to say, not everybody sees around corners the way you do, Dot. He meant it kindly. I heard it as the truest thing he ever said. Ethan called on a Sunday in March of 2023, and his voice was different, faster, lighter. The way it used to sound when he was a kid and had something he'd been holding on to all week and couldn't wait to get out. Mom, he said, I need to tell you something. I've been seeing someone. Her name is Sabrina. She's a real estate attorney here in Austin, and we met at a conference about a month ago, and I know it's fast. I know we haven't been dating that long. But Mom, I think this might actually be it. I sat down at the kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the live oaks, just beginning to come back after winter. that particular pale, almost silvery green that only lasts 2 weeks before everything deepens into summer. I said, "Tell me about her." He told me she was sharp as a tack and driven, and that she specialized in commercial property transfers. He told me she'd gone to law school at Georgetown and moved to Austin from Connecticut about 4 years back. He told me she liked hiking and good wine and had opinions about Texas barbecue that he found both wrong and charming. He told me she was beautiful in a way that made him nervous, which was not something my son had said about a woman in at least a decade, maybe ever. I asked good questions. I told him I was happy for him. I told him to bring her out to the ranch whenever he was ready, that I'd make dinner and we'd do it properly. I meant every word of that. And after we hung up, I sat at that table for a while and turned over one thing he'd said. Commercial property transfers. Not wills and estates, not family law, not criminal defense. The specific technical work of moving real property from one owner to another. Contracts, titles, deeds. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that was my investigator brain working overtime, seeing patterns that weren't there, which was an occupational hazard I had spent years being aware of and managing. I told myself to give this woman a fair chance before I'd even laid eyes on her. But I pulled out the small notebook I had kept in my desk drawer for 28 years, the one where I jotted down details that didn't have a home yet, details that might matter or might not, and I opened it to a fresh page. I wrote her name, I wrote her profession, and I wrote one question mark underneath both of them. Old habits are old habits. Before I tell you about Sabrina's first visit, I need to tell you about Walt Greer, because Walt is woven through everything that follows, and he deserves to be introduced properly. Walt is 70 years old. He lives up on the hill above my north pasture, about half a mile from my front door, in a limestone house he's owned since 1989. He was the sheriff of Gillespie County for 22 years, which means he spent more than 2 decades watching people at their most desperate and their most dishonest, and it left him with a very particular kind of quiet, not unfriendly, just careful. The kind of man who listens more than he talks and means everything he says. He and Raymond met at a cattle auction in Fredericksburg about a year before I came into the picture. They argued about Hereford versus Angus for 3 solid hours, and apparently decided that was the foundation of a friendship, because they were close until the day Raymond died. When Raymond was sick, Walt drove him to his appointments in San Antonio twice a month without being asked, without making a big deal out of it, without expecting anything in return. He just showed up on the right mornings, with his truck running and a thermos of coffee, and Raymond would come out, and they'd drive the 2 hours south as mostly in silence, and Walt would sit in the waiting room for however long it took. The night Raymond died, Walt was the one who drove me home from the hospital. We didn't talk. He just put the truck in drive and took me home, and when we pulled into the driveway and I sat there unable to make myself get out, he said quietly, "Raymond asked me to look after you." I said, "He didn't tell me that." Walt said, "Didn't need to." After that, we settled into something neither of us ever named. Monday mornings, I'd bring coffee up to his place. He'd check my north fence line after bad weather. We didn't talk every day or make plans or do any of the things that people usually do when they call something a friendship. We just knew where the other one was. That was enough. Some mornings, I'd see his kitchen light on before sunrise, and it felt like company without the weight of it, which is exactly what I needed and exactly what he understood without my having to say it. Walt Greer was the first person outside my own head who looked at Sabrina and saw what I saw, but we'll get to that. Right now it's May of 2023. The bluebonnets along the county road are just finishing up. The air smells like cedar and warm granite, and the particular green smell that comes off the pasture after a rain. My son is pulling into the driveway with a woman I have never met, and I am standing on my front porch, watching her step out of the passenger seat. She was put together in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. Dark hair, good posture, clothes that fit exactly right. She smiled at me from the driveway, and the smile was warm and well-practiced and reached her eyes at exactly the right moment. I've seen that smile before, not on her. On people I've sat across from in interview rooms, people who had learned exactly how much warmth to show and when to show it, But here's what I actually noticed, the thing I filed away without reacting to. In the 3 seconds between getting out of the car and looking at me, she looked at the house. Not the way you look at something because it's pretty or because you're curious. The way you look at something you're trying to memorize. The roofline, the porch, the layout. The way a professional looks at a property they're assessing. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she looked at me and smiled and walked across the gravel with her hand extended and said, "Mrs. Calloway, it is so good to finally meet you. Ethan talks about you in this place all the time." I shook her hand. I told her to call me Dot. I told her I was so glad she'd come out, and that evening, after they drove back to Austin, and the taillights disappeared around the bend in the county road, and I was alone again with the land and the quiet and the sound of the cattle moving in the south pasture, I went inside and I opened that notebook to the page with her name on it. Underneath the question mark, I wrote one word, watch. The dinner I made that first Saturday in May was a proper one. Not because I was nervous. I don't get nervous cooking. It's one of the few things in life that has always felt completely natural to me. But because I believed then, and I still believe now, that the way you feed people says something about how seriously you take them. I made a beef brisket that had been in the oven since 6 that morning, cornbread from scratch, green beans from the garden, and a peach cobbler that Raymond had requested for every birthday for 32 years was running. I set the table with the good dishes. I put wildflowers in a mason jar in the center, because that's what I always did, and I wasn't going to change my habits for anyone. Ethan arrived first, about 20 minutes before Sabrina, because she had gotten turned around on the county road, which happens to everyone the first time. He came through the back door, the way he always had since he was old enough to reach the handle, and he hugged me the way he always did, long and without any self-consciousness about it. And then he leaned back and looked at me with that expression he has, the one that's trying to read my face without being obvious about it. "You okay, Mom?" "I'm always okay," I said. "Go wash your hands." Sabrina arrived 7 minutes later. I heard her car on the gravel and I stayed in the kitchen. I let Ethan go out to meet her. I wanted 60 seconds to observe her coming in without her knowing she was being observed, which is a habit so deeply ingrained in me after 28 years that I don't even think about it anymore. I just do it. I watched from the kitchen window as she got out of her car. She paused for a moment in the driveway and looked up at the house, and this time I was close enough that I could see her face clearly. It wasn't the look of someone taking in a beautiful old ranch house for the first time. It was more methodical than that. Her eyes moved from the roofline to the foundation, from the garage to the outbuildings, like she was doing a quiet inventory. Ethan was talking to her and she was nodding and smiling, but her eyes were still moving. Then she looked up and caught me through the window and she smiled. And it was a good smile, a genuinely warm one. And I thought, that's the thing about her. She's quick. She noticed me watching and she turned it into a moment of connection in about half a second flat. That takes practice. She came inside and said all the right things, complimented the smell of the brisket, said the house was beautiful in a way that didn't feel performative. She asked about the photos on the mantle with what seemed like genuine curiosity, picked up the one of Ethan at about age 9, standing in the creek with a fishing rod and a sunburned nose, and a fish about a third the size of what he was claiming to have caught that day. And she laughed at it in a way that made Ethan laugh too. And for a few minutes, standing there in my living room, it felt like exactly what it was supposed to be. A family dinner, a new beginning. And then she asked her first question. We were moving toward the table. I was carrying the brisket out from the kitchen, and she said, almost as an aside, almost like it was just casual conversation, "Dot, how long has this property been in your family? Like, what's the actual history of it?" I told her, the way I told you, my grandfather, 1961, $12,000, 3 generations. She nodded, and then she said, "And when your husband passed, did it transfer directly to you, or was there a probate process?" I set the brisket down on the table. I looked at her. Ethan was getting drinks from the kitchen and couldn't see my face, which was probably good. "It transferred directly," I said. "Raymond and I had everything in order." "Oh, that's smart," she said. sitting down, unfolding her napkin with the ease of someone who is completely comfortable. A lot of people don't think about that stuff until it's too late. Kind of what I deal with all day, so I notice when people have done it right. She smiled. I smiled. Ethan came back with the drinks, and we sat down and said grace and started eating. And on the surface of it, the conversation moved on to other things. Ethan's work, a trail they'd hiked the weekend before, whether the summer was going to be as brutal as last year. Sabrina was charming and funny, and asked me good questions about my time as an investigator, seemed genuinely interested in the cases I could talk about, and laughed at the right moments. But I kept coming back to that question, probate, the transfer, said within the first 4 minutes of sitting down in my home. Before she'd tasted the food or asked about Raymond as a person or learned a single thing about me that wasn't related to this property. I have interviewed a lot of people over the years. I have sat across from people who were hiding things and people who were innocent and people who were somewhere in between. And the one consistent thing I have learned is that what people ask about first is almost always what they actually came for. The rest is just getting there. After dinner, we moved to the back porch because the evening was cool enough and the view at sunset is the kind of thing you don't keep to yourself if you can help it. The sky was doing what it does out here in late spring, turning colors in layers. Deep orange at the horizon bleeding up into pink, and then a particular shade of pale blue-green that I have never seen anywhere else, and have stopped trying to describe to people who haven't witnessed it. You just have to be here. Ethan went inside to take a call from a colleague in California, which left Sabrina and me alone on the porch for the first time. She leaned against the railing and looked out at the pasture and the hills beyond it, and for a moment she said nothing, and it was a comfortable enough silence that I almost relaxed into it. Then she said, without turning to look at me, "You must feel so lucky to have ended up with a place like this. Lucky, not proud, not grateful. Not like you've earned it or built it or held on to it through everything life threw at you. Lucky, like it was something that had happened to me rather than something I had worked for and protected and chosen over and over again for decades." "I feel grateful," I said. "My family worked hard for this land." "Of course," she said, turning to smile at me. "I just meant it must be such a comfort, having something so solid, especially now, doing it all on your own. Doing it all on your own." I was 63 years old, in excellent health, managing a working cattle ranch without any particular difficulty. But the way she said it made it sound like something I was barely managing, something precarious, something that might not hold. I looked at her in the evening light and I thought, "You are very good at this. You wrap the needle in so much softness that by the time it goes in, you're not even sure you felt it." Ethan came back out and the moment passed, and the rest of the evening was pleasant. They left around 9, Ethan hugging me at the door and whispering, "I really like her, Mom," in a way that made my heart do two things at once, expand with love for him and tighten with something I couldn't name yet. I watched their taillights go down the county road and disappear. I went inside and washed the good dishes and put them away. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook, and I wrote down everything: the probate question, the lucky comment, the way her eyes had moved over the property when she stepped out of the car, the 2 seconds she'd spent looking at the deed framed on the hallway wall. Yes, I noticed that too. She glanced at it on the way to the bathroom and paused just long enough to read it. None of it was evidence of anything. All of it was a pattern. I wrote it all down, closed the notebook, and went to bed. I lay in the dark in the room I'd shared with Raymond for 31 years, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about what my instincts were telling me and whether I was allowed to trust them. Here is the thing about being good at your job for a long time. You develop an almost physical response to certain things, a kind of alertness that doesn't feel like paranoia, because it's too quiet for that, too calm. It feels more like your body tuning in to a frequency it recognizes. I had felt it in interview rooms and courtrooms and parking lots. I had felt it sitting across from people who smiled the whole time and lied with everything they had. I felt it that night lying in my bed. I told myself I could be wrong. I told myself that Sabrina Voss might be exactly what she appeared to be, a sharp, confident woman who had fallen for my son and asked one clumsy question at dinner and made one slightly condescending remark on the porch. People say clumsy things. People make thoughtless comments. That didn't make her a threat, but I kept the notebook. The wedding was in September of 2023. Small, tasteful, held at a venue in Austin with about 40 people, all of them seeming genuinely happy to be there. Sabrina looked stunning in a simple ivory dress, and Ethan looked at her the way Raymond used to look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like something precious that he still couldn't quite believe was his. I cried during the vows, which I hadn't expected to do, and I meant the tears completely. Whatever else was true, my son was happy, and his happiness has always been able to get me like that, right in the chest, no defense against it. I danced with Ethan after dinner, and he held me the way he had at his junior prom when he was 17, and didn't know what to do with his hands. And I told him his father would have been so proud, and he pressed his face against the side of my head and didn't say anything for a moment. We just swayed there in the middle of that dance floor, with the string lights overhead and the smell of good food and the sound of people laughing at the tables around us. And I thought, whatever comes next, this moment is real. Hold on to this. I drove home to the ranch that night alone, and I sat on the back porch in the dark for a long time before going inside. Something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming in before it arrives, that particular pressure change in the air that the animals notice before the people do. I couldn't have told you what it was or where it was coming from. I just knew that the world had rearranged itself slightly and that things were not going to be the same as they'd been before. I was right. I just didn't know yet how right. The 2 months after the wedding passed quietly enough on the surface. Ethan called on Sundays, the same as always, but the calls ran shorter. Where we used to talk for an hour, now it was 20 minutes, then 15, then sometimes a quick text instead of a call at all. When we did talk, there was something different in the way he was with me, still warm, still genuinely, my son in every way that mattered, but also slightly careful, like he was editing himself, like there was a version of our conversation happening and a slightly different version he was choosing not to have. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I waited. And then on a Tuesday evening in early October, Ethan called and said, almost as soon as we'd gotten through the hellos, "Mom." Sabrina was some stuff about Texas estate law, and she's kind of concerned that you don't have a trust set up for the ranch. She says if anything happened to you, the property would have to go through probate, and it could be a real mess. There was that word again, probate. I have a will, I said. I've had a will for 15 years, and I've had the same conversation with my own lawyer. Right, but Sabrina says a will isn't the same as a trust, and with property values out there now, the estate taxes alone could. Ethan. I kept my voice gentle. I appreciate the concern. I'll look into it. Okay, he said, and then after a pause, she just wants to help Mom. She deals with this stuff all day. I know she does, I said. Tell her. I said, thank you. We hung up, and I sat there in the kitchen and I listened to the sound of the ranch settling around me in the early evening, the cattle moving out in the pasture, the creak of the porch boards in the breeze, the mockingbird that had taken up residence in the big oak by the garden and sang at all hours like he had somewhere important to be. And I thought, there it is, that's the second time in 6 months. Probate, probate, probate. I opened my notebook. I wrote down the date. I wrote down what Ethan had said, and more importantly, what Sabrina had apparently said to prompt it. Then I turned back to the first page, to the entry from May, and I looked at the word I'd written there. Watch, I underlined it. November came to the hill country the way it usually does, not with any dramatic announcement, but with a gradual cooling, the light going golden and thin, the mornings carrying that particular bite that made the cattle restless and made me want to be outside more, not less. I have always loved November out here. The tourists who come through Fredericksburg for the wildflowers and the summer heat are long gone by then, and the county goes quiet in a way that feels earned. You can drive the county roads at 7 in the morning and not pass another vehicle for 20 minutes. The hills turn amber and rust. The creek runs a little higher after the fall rains. It's the time of year when the ranch feels most like itself and most like mine. That November, Sabrina started showing up, not with Ethan, alone. The first time was a Thursday afternoon, which was odd enough that I remember it clearly. I was out in the garden pulling the last of the summer tomato plants when I heard tires on the gravel. I straightened up and looked toward the driveway, and there was her car, the silver Audi she drove, pulling up to the house like she'd been planning to stop by all along. She got out carrying a leather portfolio and wearing what I can only describe as her work clothes: pressed slacks, a blazer, heels that were absolutely wrong for a gravel driveway, but that she navigated without any trouble, because Sabrina Voss did not let terrain inconvenience her. She smiled and waved like this was the most natural thing in the world and called out, "Dot, I hope you don't mind. I was coming back from a property showing in Kerrville and I thought I'd stop by. I have some information I've been meaning to share with you." I pulled off my garden gloves. "Come on in," I said. "I'll put some coffee on." We sat at the kitchen table and she opened the portfolio and took out a neat stack of papers, printed articles, a brochure from a law firm in Austin, some kind of chart showing Texas estate tax thresholds. She laid them out with the efficiency of someone who does presentations for a living, which I suppose she did. "I've been doing some reading," she said. "And I really think you should consider a revocable living trust for the ranch. I know you've mentioned you have a will, but Dot, honestly, a will goes through probate no matter what. A trust doesn't. And with the way property values have gone up out here, the estate could be looking at some real complications when the time comes." I looked at the papers. I did not touch them. "When the time comes," I repeated. "When you pass," she said simply, like it was just a neutral fact, which hopefully isn't for a very long time. But these things need to be planned for. I looked at her across my kitchen table, this woman who had been married to my son for less than 2 months, and I thought about all the different ways there are to talk about a person's death. You can be gentle about it. You can be the kind of person who says, "when you're gone," with a hand on someone's arm and genuine softness in their voice. Sabrina said, "when you pass," the way you'd say when the contract expires, clean, clinical, like a timeline item to be managed. "I'll talk to my lawyer," I said. "Of course," she said. She left the papers on my table when she left. I didn't ask her to leave them. She just did. After her car disappeared down the road, I stood at the kitchen table and looked at those papers for a long moment. Then I stacked them neatly, put them in the recycling bin, and called Nadine Pruitt, my lawyer in Kerrville, just to check in, not because I was panicking, because I believed in staying ahead of things, and something in my gut was telling me that staying ahead was about to matter more than usual. Nadine told me everything was in order. I thanked her and we chatted for a few minutes, and I hung up feeling steadier. Then I went back out to the garden and finished pulling the tomato plants, and I thought about the word portfolio, about the fact that Sabrina had driven 40 minutes off any reasonable route between a property showing in Kerrville and Austin to come sit at my kitchen table with printed materials she'd prepared in advance. That was not a casual stop. That was a visit with a purpose, dressed up to look like a casual stop. It happened again 2 weeks later. Different excuse, same portfolio. This time she brought printed comparables, recent land sales in Gillespie County, showing what per-acre values had done over the past 5 years. The numbers were real, and the trend was clear, and if I hadn't known better, I might have thought she was just a thorough daughter-in-law, trying to make sure her mother-in-law had good information. But I did know better, and what I knew was that nobody puts together a portfolio like that for someone they're trying to help. They put it together for someone they're trying to move. The third visit in November was the one that mattered most, though I didn't fully understand why until later. She came on a Tuesday afternoon, and this time she asked if she'd see the outbuildings, said she was curious about the property layout, said Ethan had mentioned wanting to eventually put a small guest cabin on the northeast corner, and she wanted to understand the land better. It was a reasonable enough request framed in a reasonable enough way, and I said yes because saying no would have required me to explain a suspicion I couldn't yet prove. We walked the perimeter of the main structures together: the main barn, the equipment shed, the old smokehouse that hadn't been used as a smokehouse in 30 years, but that I kept because it was built by my grandfather's hands and I wasn't tearing it down. I showed her the well and the water line that ran to the south pasture and the corner of the property where the live oaks grew so thick and old that the light came through them in pieces. She asked good questions. She took a few photos on her phone, and at some point, while we were standing near the garden shed going over the irrigation setup, she asked if she could use the restroom and went back to the house alone. She was inside for about 7 minutes. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I stood by the garden shed and looked out at the south pasture and watched a red-tailed hawk working the thermals above the creek bed, and I thought about the fence line on the west boundary that needed attention before spring. 7 minutes. I have replayed those 7 minutes many times since then. I know now exactly what she did with them. She found the spare key, the one I kept in a small dish on the entry table, the one I'd had there for 15 years, because I locked myself out twice in one winter back in 2009 and swore I'd never do it again. And she pressed it against the compact key copying device she carried in her portfolio. The whole process takes under 2 minutes with the right equipment, and a real estate attorney who specializes in commercial property transfers knows that equipment exists. She had it. She used it. Then she put the key back exactly where she'd found it. I had no idea. The key was right where it always was when we went back inside. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing looked touched. Because she was careful, and careful people don't leave signs. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The carefulness in what she did to me was actually a form of precision. She was so careful about every single step that I couldn't catch any one thing. I could only feel the accumulation of them. Now, I need to tell you about Walt and what Sabrina did with him, because this is the part that moved everything from a feeling in my gut to something I could act on. It was a Friday morning in late November. Walt called me around 10, which was unusual. We were more coffee on the porch people than phone call people, and his voice had that quality it gets when he's being deliberate. Measured, he said, "Dot, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you react." I said, "Go ahead, Walt." He told me that Sabrina had stopped by his place the previous afternoon. Said she'd been driving out to check on me and decided to stop in and introduce herself properly, which was the first time she'd ever done that. She'd been pleasant enough, Walt said, brought a tin of cookies, asked about his years as sheriff with what seemed like genuine interest. And then, about 20 minutes into the visit, she'd gotten a little more serious and said she was worried about me. Said she'd noticed I seemed more forgetful lately. Had I seemed that way to him? Was I remembering to lock the house up at night? She asked whether I'd mentioned anything about leaving the stove on or losing track of appointments. Walt stopped talking and let the silence sit for a moment. I didn't say anything, he said. She was real smooth about it, Dot. Real careful. Framed the whole thing like concern. But I did this job for 22 years. And I know what it looks like when somebody is building a file on a person. She was building a file on you. I sat down slowly in the kitchen chair, not because my legs gave out, but because something in me needed to be still for a moment, needed to let that settle properly before I responded. Sabrina had come to see Walt, had asked a retired sheriff, a man whose word would carry weight with anyone in this county, whether Dorothy Calloway was showing signs of cognitive decline, had done it with a tin of cookies and a pleasant smile and the language of worry. If Walt had taken that conversation at face value, if he'd said, "Yes, now that you mention it, she does seem forgetful," she would have had something. A witness, a corroborating voice. She had not counted on Walt Greer spending 22 years learning exactly how to tell the difference between someone who was worried and someone who was working. "Thank you, Walt," I said. "This helps. What do you want me to do?" "Nothing yet. But if she comes back, let her talk." After I hung up, I stayed in that chair for a long time. The mockingbird was going at it outside, cycling through his repertoire with no regard for my state of mind. And the afternoon light was coming in low through the kitchen windows, the way it does in late November, lying in long gold bars across the floor. This was not a daughter-in-law who had overstepped. This was not thoughtlessness or bad judgment or misguided concern. What Sabrina was doing had structure to it. It had sequence. First, establish access to the property. Then establish a narrative about the owner's competence. Then, what? I could see where the sequence was heading, even if I couldn't see the final step yet. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Raymond died. I sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen, and I wrote a letter to Ethan. I wrote about what I'd observed over the past months, laid out the visits and the questions and the portfolio and what Walt had told me. I wrote it all down and I folded it and I held it in my hands. And then I sat there for a long time, thinking about what it would do to my son to receive that letter, thinking about the way his face had looked at the wedding, thinking about the word he'd used on the phone. She just wants to help, Mom. In that voice, that was his own voice, but that lately seemed to come with a faint defensiveness I'd never heard him use with me in 34 years. I thought about what happens when you tell someone something they're not ready to hear. I'd done it professionally more times than I could count. I knew that being right was not the same as being effective. Being right too early, without the evidence to back it up, didn't protect anyone. It just put the person you were trying to reach on the other side of a wall. I unfolded the letter and I read it again. Then I held it over the candle I had burning on the table, and I let it catch and burn down to nothing in the ashtray Raymond used to use. Not because I doubted what I'd written, because I didn't have enough yet, because what I needed was not to tell Ethan what I suspected. What I needed was to give him something he couldn't explain away. I needed proof. December 14th was a Friday. I remember the date because of what happened on it, but I didn't know yet that I would remember it for that reason. At the time, it was just a Friday, the kind of cold and clear December day that makes the hill country look like a painting. The sky so blue it almost hurts to look at it straight on. Sabrina called that morning and said she was going to stop by with some materials from the State Bar of Texas she'd requested on my behalf. Information about estate planning resources available to property owners over 60. Could she drop them off that afternoon? She'd need me to sign a confirmation form saying I'd received the materials. Just for her records, I said, of course. I had been out working on the water pump on the west property line since 7 that morning, and I was tired and cold and ready to be indoors. She arrived around 2 in the afternoon with a leather folder thick with papers. We sat at the kitchen table. She went through the top pages efficiently, explaining each one, and then she slid the stack across to me and showed me where to initial and sign at the bottom of various pages to confirm receipt. I was tired. My hands were still a little stiff from the cold. The pages all looked like the same kind of thing. Informational documents, resource guides, Bar Association letterhead. I initialed, I signed, 4 or 5 times wherever her finger pointed. She gathered the pages back up efficiently, tucked them into her folder, thanked me for my time, and left. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table and watched the late afternoon light move across the kitchen floor and thought about nothing in particular. I had no idea what I had just signed. I would not find out for another month. But I remember that December 14th felt like just another Friday. And I remember thinking, as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, that whatever was coming, I needed to be ready for it faster than I'd been moving. I just didn't know yet that the thing I needed to be ready for had already happened. The letter from the Gillespie County Clerk's office arrived a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January. It came in a standard white envelope with the county seal in the upper left corner, the kind of envelope that usually contains something administrative and dull. A property tax notice, a zoning update, a reminder about a registration renewal. I pulled it out of the mailbox, along with a seed catalog and a bill from the electric company, and I carried all 3 back up the driveway toward the house without any particular sense of urgency. I opened it at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee. I read it once. Then I set it down and looked out the window at the pasture for a moment. Then I picked it up and read it again. More slowly this time, the way you read something when your brain is trying to find an alternative interpretation and coming up empty. There wasn't one. The letter was a standard notification from the county clerk's office, informing me that a legal instrument had been recorded in my name on December 14th of the previous year, a durable power of attorney, The document named me, Dorothy May Calloway, as the principal, the person granting the authority. It named my son, Ethan Raymond Calloway, as the agent, the person receiving the authority. The scope of the authority granted included the management and disposition of real property, the execution of contracts related to real estate transactions, and the management of financial accounts related to property ownership. The document had been prepared by Sabrina Voss Calloway, attorney at law. It had been witnessed and notarized by Sabrina Voss Calloway, attorney at law, and it bore my signature, or something that looked enough like my signature that it had passed through the county clerk's office without question. December 14th. I sat very still with that letter in my hands, and I took myself back to that Friday afternoon, the cold, clear December day. The water pump I'd been working on since 7 in the morning, the leather folder thick with papers, the State Bar of Texas letterhead on page after page of what I'd been told were informational materials and resource guides. Sabrina's finger pointing to line after line, showing me where to initial, where to sign, her voice smooth and professional and moving at just the right pace. Not rushed, not slow, just efficient, the way you are when you do this for a living and you know exactly how long someone's patience lasts. She had put the power of attorney in the middle of that stack, not at the top where I might have read it carefully, not at the bottom where I might have been suspicious about why she was saving the most important thing for last. In the middle, between a brochure from the Texas AgriLife Extension Service and a 2-page summary of property tax exemptions for seniors. Right where a tired woman with cold, stiff hands and no particular reason to be on guard would move through it without stopping. I had initialed the pages before it and after it. I had signed the line at the bottom of it. I had signed a durable power of attorney giving my son, and through my son, his wife, who had prepared the document and was the attorney of record, authority over my land. I put the letter down on the table. I looked at the wall across from me, the one where Raymond had hung a watercolor his mother painted of the ranch in the 1990s. It wasn't a technically perfect painting, but it was true. It captured something about the light out here, the way it comes in low and warm and makes everything look like it's glowing from the inside. I looked at that painting for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Nadine Pruitt. She answered on the second ring, the way she almost always does, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about Nadine. She does not make you leave messages for things that are urgent. Nadine, I said, I need to see you today, this morning, if possible. There was a brief pause. Nadine has known me for 10 years, and she knows that I do not say things like that unless I mean them precisely. Can you be here by 10:30? She said. I'll leave in 20 minutes. I drove to Kerrville with the letter on the passenger seat beside me. The drive takes about 40 minutes on a good day, and I drove it without the radio on, which is not my usual habit because I needed the quiet. I needed to think through what I knew and what I didn't know and what the range of possibilities was before I sat down with Nadine and started making decisions. Here is what I knew. A durable power of attorney bearing my signature had been recorded with the county clerk on December 14th, the same day Sabrina had visited with her folder of papers. The document gave Ethan authority over my real property. Ethan almost certainly did not know he had this authority, because if he had known, the whole dynamic of this conversation would have been different, which meant the document had been prepared without his knowledge, recorded without his knowledge, and was sitting in the county records waiting to be used. Here is what I suspected, but couldn't yet prove, that this had been the plan from the beginning, or close to it, that every visit, every conversation, every careful cultivation of a narrative about my declining competence had been in service of this moment, getting my signature on a document that would give her legal access to 340 acres of land worth $4.2 million. Nadine's office is on the 4th floor of a limestone building on the main street in Kerrville, with windows that look out over the Guadalupe River. She met me at the door, took one look at my face, and said, "Sit down, coffee?" "Please," I said. I gave her the letter. She read it the way lawyers read things, quickly but completely, her eyes moving without expression. Then she set it on the desk and folded her hands. Tell me everything, she said, from the beginning. So I did. I told her about the dinner in May, the probate questions, the portfolio visits, what Walt had told Sabrina's conversation with him. I told her about December 14th, the leather folder, the pages I'd signed without reading closely enough. I told her all of it in order, the way I'd been trained to present a case, the way that makes the pattern visible. Nadine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dot, a durable power of attorney is one of the most powerful legal documents that exists in this state. If this signature is valid, and I have to tell you, even a signature obtained through deception can be legally valid depending on the circumstances, then Ethan has authority right now to execute a real estate transaction on your behalf. He could sign a contract to sell your land. He could sign a lease. He could encumber the property with a lien, all of it legal on its face, all of it your signature authorizing it, none of it requiring your knowledge or consent for each individual action. I said, can we revoke it? We can revoke it today, she said. A POA can be revoked by the principal at any time as long as the principal is competent, which you clearly are. I'll prepare a notice of revocation and we'll file it with the county clerk this afternoon. From that point forward, the POA is legally void. But, I said, because I could hear one coming. But if she's already used it to initiate something, a contract, a sale, any kind of transaction, revoking it going forward doesn't automatically undo what's already been done. We need to find out if there's been any activity. I nodded. What else? Nadine picked up her pen. We put the ranch into a revocable living trust with you as the sole trustee. That means any transaction involving this property requires your signature as trustee, not just your signature as an individual. Even if she manufactured another document tomorrow, it wouldn't give her access to assets held in a properly structured trust. How long does that take? A week, maybe less if we move quickly. I'll start the paperwork today. Good, I said. What else? She looked at me with the expression she gets when she's about to say something she knows I'm not going to enjoy. You need to think carefully about Ethan. Whatever we do legally, he is named as the agent in this document. He may or may not know what's been done in his name. Either way, at some point, he needs to know what's happening. I know, I said. Not yet. Not yet, Nadine. If I tell him now, without evidence he can see and hear for himself, I'm asking him to choose between his mother's word and his wife's. I've seen what that does to people. I need something he can't explain away. She held at my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once slow. All right, she said. Then we build it. She started writing. I watched her hand move across the legal pad and felt something settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of moving from open water onto solid ground. I had a lawyer. I had a plan. I had 28 years of knowing how this kind of thing worked. What I needed now was evidence. I called Walt from the parking lot after I left Nadine's office. Walt, I said, how would you feel about having coffee with my daughter-in-law? There was a pause. Depends on the coffee. I'm serious. I know you are. Another pause. What do you need? I told him what I was thinking. That if Sabrina approached him again, or if he reached out to her first under the guise of being a concerned neighbor, she might say things to him that she wouldn't say to me. That Walt, a retired sheriff, a man in his 70s, someone she'd already identified as a potential ally in her narrative, was exactly the kind of person she might be willing to be candid with. That Texas was a one-party consent state, which meant he could legally record any conversation he was a part of without telling the other person. Walt was quiet for a moment. You want me to wear a wire, he said. I want you to have a conversation, I said. What you do to remember it is up to you. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. I could picture him standing at his kitchen window, looking out at the hills the way he does when he's thinking something through. Raymond would have gotten a kick out of this, he said. Raymond would have been in the truck already, I said. Walt made a sound that might have been a laugh. All right, Dot. Set it up. The notice of revocation was filed with the Gillespie County Clerk that same afternoon, January 18th. The revocable living trust was finalized and recorded 5 days later, on January 23rd. From that point forward, Sabrina Voss Calloway could file whatever documents she wanted with whatever seal she could find, and none of it would touch the ranch. The trust superseded everything. The property was protected, but Sabrina didn't know any of that. As far as she knew, the POA was still active. As far as she knew, I was an aging widow who hadn't noticed the letter from the county clerk, or had noticed it and didn't understand what it meant, or had called her son and been gently talked down from any concern. As far as she knew, she was still winning. I needed her to keep believing that. 2 days after the trust was finalized, I drove to the Adult Protective Services office in Fredericksburg, where I had been volunteering one afternoon a week for the past year and a half. I knew the supervisor well, a practical woman named Gail, who had been doing this work for 15 years and had heard every variation of every story there was to hear. I sat down in her office and told her what I was telling you now, and I watched her expression move from careful neutrality to focused concern as the picture assembled itself. She opened a case file. That was how Deputy Carla Odom got involved. She was assigned to the APS case as law enforcement liaison, and I met with her the following week in Gail's office and told her everything I'd told Gail. And she listened with the particular quality of attention that good law enforcement people have, the kind that makes you feel like every word is being filed away in exactly the right place. I told her I didn't want Sabrina arrested yet. I told her I wanted to give her enough rope to finish what she'd started, because a plan interrupted was just a plan delayed, and I needed this finished permanently. Carla looked at me for a moment and then nodded and said she understood, and I believed her. By the end of January, the pieces were in place. The trust was recorded. The revocation was filed. APS had an open case. Carla Odom knew the situation, and Walt Greer was about to have coffee with my daughter-in-law. All I needed now was for Sabrina to keep moving forward. People who are running a long con have a particular vulnerability, and it's this: they get invested. The longer the plan runs, the more they've put into it, the harder it becomes to stop or change course, even when things start to feel off. They've told themselves a story about how this ends, and they need that story to be true, and so they keep moving toward it, even when the ground is shifting under their feet. Sabrina had been running this particular plan for the better part of a year. She was not going to stop now. That was exactly what I was counting on. Walt called Sabrina on a Monday morning in early February and introduced himself as Raymond's old friend and Dot's neighbor, which was true, and said he'd been meaning to reach out since the wedding because he felt like he'd never properly welcomed her to the family, which was also true in the way that things can be technically true while serving a different purpose entirely. He suggested coffee in Fredericksburg, somewhere neutral, somewhere she'd feel comfortable. She agreed. Of course she did. Walt was exactly the kind of person she'd been trying to get to since November, a retired authority figure with deep roots in the county, someone whose opinion of Dorothy Calloway would carry weight if it ever needed to. She'd already tried once to plant us with him and hadn't been sure how well it had taken. This felt like a second chance arriving on its own, which is the kind of thing that happens when you're running a plan that's been going well and you start believing the universe is cooperating with you. They met at a small coffee shop on the main street in Fredericksburg on a Wednesday morning. Walt wore his regular clothes, a flannel shirt, his good boots, the canvas jacket he'd had for 15 years. He did not look like a man carrying a recording device. He looked like what he was, a rancher in his 70s who'd spent his whole life in this county and moved through it with the ease of someone who belonged here completely. He told me later that Sabrina arrived 3 minutes early, which he noted because people who arrive early to meetings they've agreed to are almost always the ones who want control of the space before the other person gets there. She had already ordered when he walked in, already had her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, already had the slight lean-forward posture of someone who is ready to be charming. Walt sat down across from her and smiled and said it was good to finally meet her properly, and she said the same. And they made the kind of small talk that happens at the beginning of conversations that are about something else entirely. He asked about Austin. She asked about his years as sheriff. He talked about the county the way only someone who had policed it for 22 years could talk about it, with the specific texture-rich knowledge of a person who has been in every corner of a place at its worst and its best. She listened with what seemed like genuine interest, and then about 15 minutes in, Walt did what he had agreed to do. He leaned back slightly in his chair and got a little quieter, a little more personal, and he said, "I'll be honest with you, Sabrina. I've been a little worried about Dot lately." He told me her eyes changed immediately. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that, but something sharpened behind them. "In what way?" she said. "She just seems like she's got a lot on her plate," Walt said. "Ranch that size on her own, getting older. I check in on her when I can, but I'm not as young as I used to be either. I just wonder sometimes if she's really managing as well as she says she is." Sabrina nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has been waiting for an opening and is deciding how wide to push it. "I've had the same concerns," she said. "Ethan worries about her constantly. And honestly, between you and me, I've noticed some things that have been a little unsettling." Walt said, "Like what?" And here is where Sabrina made the mistake that people make when they believe they are in a safe conversation with someone who is on their side. She stopped being careful. She talked about the estate planning documents she'd brought Dot over the fall, and how Dot had seemed confused about what she was signing us so, had asked the same question twice, hadn't seemed to retain information the way you'd expect. She talked about her concerns about Dot living alone on such a large property. She talked about how she and Ethan had been trying to put things in order, just to make sure Dot was protected, just to make sure the property didn't end up in a legal mess if something happened. And then she said the thing that Walt repeated to me word for word that evening on the phone. She said, "We've actually been in conversations with a development partner in San Antonio. They're very interested in the eastern parcel, about 140 acres along the creek. The timing is good, the price per acre is exceptional right now, and frankly, I think simplifying the property would be a real relief for Dot, even if she doesn't quite see it that way yet. We just need to get the paperwork finalized. Once it's done and she can see the numbers, I think she'll understand it was the right move." Walt said, "Has she agreed to the sale?" Sabrina said she will. At her age, sometimes you have to make decisions on someone's behalf and trust that they'll come around once they see the outcome. It's really about what's best for her in the long run. Walt said, "I see," Sabrina said, "we just need everything to fall into place quietly. The less back and forth with Dot at this stage, the smoother it'll go." Walt said he thought he understood, thanked her for the coffee, said he was glad they'd had a chance to talk, and shook her hand at the door with the same calm, unhurried manner he'd had for the entire conversation. He drove home, called me from his truck in the parking lot of the hardware store, and played me the recording over the phone. I listened to her voice coming through the phone speaker, small and slightly tinny, but perfectly clear. I listened to every word. Then I said, "Walt, thank you." He said, "You were right about her." I said, "I know. I wish I wasn't." He said, "What do you need now?" I said, "Send me the file." I called Nadine that same evening and told her what the recording contained. When I finished, she said very quietly, "Dot, she just described a plan to execute a real estate transaction on your behalf without your informed consent, using a power of attorney she obtained through deception for the benefit of a third party she has a relationship with. That is elder financial exploitation under Texas law. That is a felony." I said, "I know what it is. We need to give this to Carla. I know that too. But Nadine, I want to catch her in the act, not just with a recording of what she plans to do. I want her on my property, with the documents, making the move. I want it so clean there's no room to argue about intent or interpretation, or whether she was just being overzealous and trying to help. I want it undeniable." There was a pause. "Then we need to give her a reason to move," Nadine said. "I know how to do that," I said. "I just need Ethan." Nadine then told me one more thing. She had been investigating the development company in San Antonio that Sabrina had mentioned to Walt. She had found what she was looking for. The company was called Crestline Land Partners. It had been registered in Bexar County in October of 2023, 1 month after Ethan and Sabrina's wedding. One of its three founding members was a man named Gregory Voss, Sabrina's brother. Nadine read me from an email exchange she had obtained through the APS subpoena process. Sabrina writing to Gregory, dated October 8th, 2023. The POA is the cleanest route. Once it's in place, the Callaway parcel moves without friction. She won't contest if we move fast enough. October 8th, 2023. Crestline was incorporated on October 3rd. The wedding was September 14th. I sat with that for a moment. The company had been formed 3 weeks after the wedding. The email had been written 3 weeks after that. This was not an opportunity that had presented itself during the marriage. This was a plan that had been in place before the ink was dry on the marriage certificate, possibly before the wedding itself. She married Ethan for this, I said, not a question. That is what the evidence suggests, Nadine said carefully. I looked out the kitchen window at 340 acres going dark in the late afternoon. The cattle were moving toward the water tank. The mockingbird had gone quiet for once. Call Carla Odom, I said. I want her to have all of this. I had been thinking about Ethan for 2 weeks, about when to bring him in and how to do it and what it would cost him, because it was going to cost him something, no matter how carefully I handled it. There was no version of this where my son came through the next few months without pain. The question was only whether he came through with his eyes open or whether the truth found him some other way, harder and without warning. I called him on a Thursday evening and asked him to come to the gym that weekend alone. He heard something in my voice because he said immediately, "Is everything okay, Mom?" And I said, "Just come, sweetheart, we need to talk." He arrived on Saturday around noon. He came through the back door the way he always had since he was old enough to reach the handle, and he hugged me, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me with his father's eyes and waited. I had laid it out before he arrived. The letter from the county clerk, the power of attorney, the notice of revocation, and the trust documents. A printed transcript of the relevant portion of Walt's recording with the audio file on my phone ready to play. And the Crestline information, the incorporation date, the founding members, the email. I started at the beginning. I told him everything in the order it had happened, without editorializing, without asking him to feel any particular way about it, just the facts in sequence. The dinner in May and the probate questions, the portfolio visits, what Walt had told me about Sabrina's visit to his house in November, December 14th, and the stack of papers I'd signed, the letter from the county clerk, what Nadine had told me about what a durable power of attorney meant in practice, the revocation, the trust, Walt's meeting with Sabrina in Fredericksburg and what she had said, and then Crestline, Gregory Voss. The email dated 3 weeks after their wedding. I put my phone on the table and I played him the recording. He listened with his hands flat on the table and his face very still. Not the stillness of someone who is not reacting, the stillness of someone who is reacting to too many things at once and holding very, very steady. When it ended, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said slowly, "She said once it's done and she can see the numbers, she'll understand it was the right move." "Yes," I said. "She was talking about you." "Yes, like you don't get a vote." "That's right." He looked down at the table. I watched him go through something that I couldn't help him with and didn't try to, because some things have to be felt fully before they can be moved through, and rushing someone past their grief, even the grief of a necessary disillusionment, is one of the cruelest things you can do to a person. After a while, he said, "How long has she been planning this?" "The company was formed 3 weeks after your wedding," I said. The email to her brother was written the week after that. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he used to do as a teenager when he was processing something he didn't want to be true. Then he looked at me. "What do you need me to do?" I told him. I needed him to call Sabrina and tell her I'd agreed to move forward with the Eastern parcel sale, that I'd asked him to let her know I wanted to finalize things quickly before I changed my mind, that I wouldn't be home on the morning of March 15th. I had an early appointment in Kerrville and would be gone until mid-morning. He understood immediately. He understood that the empty house was the invitation, that Sabrina would come to get the paperwork in order while she believed I wasn't there, that she would say things in a house she thought was empty that would leave no room for anyone to argue about what she had intended. He said, "She'll bring the deed transfer documents." "Yes," I said. "And she'll use the key she copied." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have seen this." "You were in love," I said. "That's not a character flaw. That's just being human. I should have listened when you tried to tell me something was off." "You're listening now," I said. "That's enough." He left that afternoon with the weight of it on him, visible in the set of his shoulders and the way he held his mouth, but also with something else, something steadier underneath the grief, something that looked like resolve. He called Sabrina that evening. I don't know exactly what he said to her because I wasn't on the call, and I didn't ask him to recount it word for word. What I know is what happened next. She called him back within the hour, and she was pleased. He could hear it in her voice, that particular tone of controlled excitement that she got when a plan was moving in the right direction. She said she'd take care of everything. She said March 15th was perfect. She said not to worry. After he got off the phone, he texted me one word: "Done." That night, I sat out on the back porch for a long time after dark. The temperature had dropped, and I had Raymond's old jacket on, the heavy canvas one that still smelled faintly of him if I held the collar close enough, which I knew was probably my imagination at this point, but I didn't care. The stars out here in the hill country are something that people who've only lived in cities genuinely cannot picture. There is no competing light for miles in any direction. And on a clear night in March, the sky is so dense with them that it looks almost textured, almost like something you could reach up and touch. I sat out there and I looked up at those stars and I thought about my grandfather in this same pasture in 1961 and my father holding on through the drought and Raymond driving to San Antonio twice a month with Walt in the truck and not complaining once. I thought about what it meant to be the person holding something that was bigger than you, something that asked more of you than you sometimes felt you had. I thought about Ethan calling me every Sunday for 6 years without missing one, even from the top of a ridge in Big Bend with 2 bars of service. I thought she picked the wrong family. At 5:30 in the morning on March 15th, my phone lit up with a text from Carla Odom, "In position, ready when you are." I put the phone down on the nightstand and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch around me, the sound of the cattle shifting in the south pasture, the mockingbird starting up absurdly early the way he always did, the particular creak of the old house settling in the pre-dawn cold. 17 minutes later, Walt called Dot. Walt's voice was steady, the way it always was, but underneath the steadiness there was something else, a particular quality of alertness that I recognized from the few times over the years when he'd called me about something that actually mattered. "There's a silver Audi and a black SUV just turned onto your county road, moving truck behind them. I count 3 vehicles total, maybe 6 or 7 people. Sabrina's driving the Audi." I was already sitting up in bed. I had been lying awake for the better part of an hour, not anxious exactly, just present, just waiting for the day to begin the way it was going to begin. "How far out?" I said. 4 minutes, maybe 5. "Is Carla still in position?" "Her vehicle's behind my barn. She's been there since 5:30. "Good," I said. "Walt, stay on your hill. Don't come down until I call you." "You sure?" "I'm sure. And Walt, thank you for all of it." There was a brief pause. "Raymond would have done the same," he said, which was his way of saying you're welcome without actually saying it, which was very Walt. I ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark. Outside the window, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges, that very first gray before any color comes into it, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. I could hear the cattle moving in the south pasture. The mockingbird, impossibly, was already going. I stood up and pulled on my jeans and Raymond's old flannel shirt, the soft one, the color of pine needles that I had washed so many times it was thin at the elbows and still could not bring myself to throw away. I picked up my coffee mug from the nightstand. I'd made coffee at 4:30 when I'd given up on sleeping, and I walked down the hallway to the living room, and I stood in the dark and I waited. I heard her before I saw her. Tires on the gravel, slow, and deliberate. The particular sound of a car door closing with the careful quiet of someone who is trying not to make noise, which always strikes me as a strange instinct because the gravel announces everything regardless. Then voices, low, professional, the sound of another door, footsteps, and then at the front door, the sound I had been waiting for. A key in the lock, not a knock, not a call of hello or anyone home. A key inserted smoothly and turned with the ease of someone who had practiced this moment in their head many times, someone who had been waiting to do this one specific thing for a very long time. The door opened. I stood in the hallway and I did not move. She came in ahead of the others. I could see her through the gap where the hallway met the living room. She was wearing dark slacks and a blazer the color of charcoal, her hair pulled back, dressed for something more formal than a ranch visit, dressed for a closing. She moved through my living room the way she had always moved through my living room, with a proprietary ease that had always been slightly off, but that I had now seen enough times to understand completely. She was not visiting. She had never been visiting. Every time she had walked through this door, she had been doing what she was doing right now, moving through a space she had decided it was already hers. She went straight to the fireplace mantel. She picked up the photograph of Raymond and me, the one from our 32nd anniversary, taken on the back porch by Ethan, the two of us squinting a little into the evening sun with the hills going gold behind us. Raymond had his arm around my shoulders, and I was laughing at something he'd said right before Ethan hit the button. Something I don't even remember now. Just the laughing. She looked at it for 2 seconds. Then she placed it face down on the mantel. She said quietly to the empty room she believed she was standing in, finally, "This is mine now." I stepped out of the hallway. She heard me before she saw me and she turned, and the expression that crossed her face in that first half second was something I will not forget. It was not guilt and it was not fear, not yet. It was a kind of pure, unprocessed shock, the shock of a reality that does not match the one you had prepared for, the shock of a script that has suddenly lost its last page. Then she composed herself. She was fast. I'll give her that. She was genuinely fast. "Dot," she said, and her voice was almost steady. "I didn't realize you were here. Ethan said you had an appointment." Ethan said what I asked him to say, so I said. I kept my voice quiet. I was not angry, or if I was, it was the kind of anger that had been sitting long enough to become something cooler and more useful. "Come and sit down, Sabrina." She didn't sit. She stood in the middle of my living room with her leather portfolio held against her chest, and she looked at me with something moving behind her eyes, something calculating, trying to find the shape of what was happening and how much I knew, and how much damage needed to be controlled. The two people she'd brought with her, a young woman with a stack of folders and a man in his 40s, wearing a jacket with the San Antonio Real Estate Company's logo on the breast pocket, were standing near the front door looking deeply uncomfortable. The moving truck had stopped at the end of the driveway. Nobody from outside had come in yet. Then the front door opened again, and Deputy Carla Odom stepped inside. She was in uniform, calm, with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that rushing rarely improves outcomes. The APS investigator, a woman named Grace, who I had met twice in Gail's office, came in behind her. Carla looked around the room. She looked at Sabrina. She looked at me. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you for being here." Carla turned to Sabrina. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Odom with the Gillespie County Sheriff's Office. I'm going to need to see the documents you're carrying, and I'm going to need you to explain to me the basis for your presence in this residence." Sabrina straightened. The control came back into her voice. Not all of it, but enough. "I'm here on behalf of my husband, Ethan Calloway, who holds power of attorney for this property. We're here to execute a real estate transaction that Mrs. Calloway has agreed to. Everything is completely legal and above board, and I'm not sure why law enforcement is involved." Carla said, "Can I see the power of attorney document?" Sabrina opened her portfolio and produced it. The same document. December 14th. My signature, or what looked like my signature at the bottom. Carla took it. She read it with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to everything, And then she reached into the folder she was carrying and produced 2 documents of her own. This, she said, holding up the first one, is a notice of revocation for this power of attorney, filed with the Gillespie County Clerk on January 18th of this year. The document you've just given me was legally revoked approximately 8 weeks ago. Any transaction executed under it after that date is void and potentially criminal. She held up the second document, and this is the recording instrument for a revocable living trust, established January 23rd, naming Dorothy May Calloway as sole trustee. Any transaction involving this property requires Mrs. Calloway's signature in her capacity as trustee, not her signature as an individual, and not a power of attorney granted to anyone else. The room was very quiet. The young woman with the folders had taken a small step backward toward the door. The man with the San Antonio jacket had his phone out and was looking at it, without appearing to be reading anything on it. Sabrina said, "That's not possible. I filed those transfer documents last week. They should have been recorded by now." "They were rejected," Carla said. "The clerk's office flagged the filing because of the trust instrument. You would have received a notification." Something flickered across Sabrina's face. She had not received the notification. Or she had received and had decided to proceed anyway, which told me something about how confident she had been that this morning was going to go the way she'd planned it. She turned to me. The charming practice warmth was completely gone now. What was underneath it was harder and more honest, and in some ways easier to deal with, because at least it was real. "You set me up," she said. "I protected myself," I said. "There's a difference. You've been planning this." "Since January," I said. "Since the letter from the county clerk arrived and I understood what you'd done on December 14th. I paused. "You made one mistake, Sabrina. You chose someone who spent 28 years learning how to recognize exactly what you were doing. I've put people in front of prosecutors for less than what you've done here. The only thing different about this time is that it's my home." Her jaw tightened. "I was helping you. Everything I did was to protect your assets, to make sure Ethan had the ability to manage things if you became incapacitated. You told a retired sheriff that once the sale was done, you'd explain it to me and I'd come around," I said. "You told him it would go smoother with less back and forth from me at this stage. That's on a recording, Sabrina, in your voice, saying those words." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. Grace, the APS investigator, stepped forward and began speaking to the young woman with the folders in a low professional voice, asking her name and her role and what documents she had been given to bring today. The man with the San Antonio jacket was already on his phone, turned slightly away, his voice too low to hear. Carla said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come outside with me." Sabrina didn't move immediately. She stood there in the middle of my living room, in the house she had walked through a dozen times with the proprietary ease of someone taking inventory, and she looked around it one more time. I don't know what she was looking for. Maybe just trying to hold on to the version of this morning she had planned for, the version where this was empty and the documents got signed and the land started moving in her direction. Then the front door opened and Ethan walked in. He had driven down from Austin the night before and slept at Walt's place, which had been his idea, not mine. He stood in the doorway in his jacket with his keys still in his hand, and he looked at his wife in the middle of his mother's living room, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that I was not meant to understand and completely and did not try to. She said, "Ethan." Her voice dropped into something softer, something that reached for the registers it used when it needed something from him. "Ethan, I need you to tell them. Tell them this was agreed to. Tell them we were trying to help your mother. Tell them, Sabrina," he said. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way you say someone's name when you want them to stop talking before they make something worse. "I called you last week and told you Mom had agreed to the sale, that she wanted to move fast, that she wouldn't be home this morning." She stared at him. "I made that up," he said. "Mom asked me to. She needed to know what you'd do if you thought the house was empty and the deal was moving. Now we know." The thing that crossed her face in that moment was not something I had a name for. It was beyond anger and beyond shock. It was the expression of someone who has built an entire architecture of assumptions about the people around them and has just felt the whole thing drop out from under them at once. She had assumed Ethan was manageable. She had assumed that his loyalty to her was more durable than his loyalty to me. She had assumed, I think, that his love for her had replaced something rather than existing alongside something that was older and deeper and had been there his whole life. She had been wrong about all of it. Carla put a hand gently on Sabrina's arm and guided her toward the door, and Sabrina went, because there was nothing left to do but go. The man from San Antonio had already walked out. The young woman with the folders was outside talking to Grace. The moving truck at the end of the driveway had not moved, and I could see one of the men from the truck crew standing beside it with his arms crossed, looking like a person who had driven a long way for something that was very clearly not going to happen. Ethan and I stood in the living room after the door closed. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, the one of Raymond and me, still lying face down where Sabrina had placed it. He walked over and picked it up and set it right again, adjusted it slightly so it was straight, and then stood there looking at it for a moment. She put it face down, he said. Yes, when she came in, before she said anything, that was the first thing she did. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. Then he turned and looked at me, and his eyes were red at the edges but dry, and he said, Is it over? The hard part is, I said. The rest is just paperwork. I poured him coffee, and we sat at the Tat kitchen table together in the early morning light while outside the county came awake around us, the sky going from gray to pale gold, the cattle starting to move toward the water tank, the mockingbird cycling through his whole repertoire with the relentless optimism of a creature that greets every single morning the same way, regardless of what the day before contained. It took 4 months for the legal proceedings to conclude. Sabrina entered a plea agreement in July, admitting to elder financial exploitation, attempted fraud, and unauthorized entry. She received 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a civil judgment of $85,000. Crestline Land Partners was dissolved as part of the settlement. Gregory Voss faced a separate investigation for conspiracy and eventually accepted a plea of his own. Ethan filed for divorce in April. He did not contest anything. He moved into an apartment in Fredericksburg, which meant he was 20 minutes away instead of an hour, which was an outcome I had not anticipated, and which I have thought about many times since with a gratitude I find difficult to fully articulate. He comes out to the ranch every weekend now. Sometimes we work. Sometimes we just sit on the back porch and look at the hills. Last September, he asked me to teach him how to manage the south pasture rotation the way Raymond used to do it, and I did. And watching him walk that fence line in the late afternoon with the same unhurried attention his father used to bring to it was one of the finer moments of my recent life. Walt came over one evening in October with a couple of cold beers and sat on the porch until the stars came out and didn't say much, which is the highest form of company as far as I'm concerned. At some point, he said, Raymond would have been proud, and I said I knew, and we left it at that. The ranch is 340 acres. The creek still runs along the southwest corner. The cattle are fine. The live oaks along the county road are the same ones my grandfather passed in 1961 when he first came to look at this land and decided it was worth working 2 jobs for 4 years to own. Last spring, I planted a row of new live oaks along the driveway. 20 trees, spaced evenly, about 30 inches tall right now. They will take 20 years to give meaningful shade. I will probably not be here to sit under them at their best, and I planted them anyway, because that is how this place has always worked. You tend things whose full benefit you will not live to see, and you trust that someone who comes after you will understand why you did it. I think Ethan will understand. I think he already does. Now, before I go, I want to say something directly to you. I did not tell you this story to make myself sound clever or to make Sabrina sound like a monster, though what she did was monstrous. I told you this story because I know there are people listening right now who are living some version of it. Maybe not as far along. Maybe just at the beginning, just at the stage of a question that felt slightly off, a visit that lingered a little too long, A document slips across a table at just the right moment. Trust that feeling. Write it down. Call your lawyer before you think you need to. The people who do this for a living are counting on you to wait too long, to doubt yourself, to decide you're being paranoid and let it go. Don't let it go. Love inside a family is real. But so is what happened here. Both things can be true, and knowing the difference is not a betrayal of the love. It is how you protect it. The land is still here, and so am I.